Good morning. Welcome to the Go Create Grant Application Overview webinar on the 8th of July 2021. Apologies for a slightly late start. This was, as you may expect, IT issues primarily related to me. So this is one of those rare occasions where I am fairly critical to the presentation of the webinar. But I'm here now. If at any point I disappear and you suddenly can't hear me, please stick a comment into the chat. You can tell I have a degree of faith in the IT that I'm using this morning. My name is James Rule. I'm the compliance consultant for OxLEP. So my role is to support with keeping the programs, including the Innovation Support for Business program and the Go Create grants, compliant and delivered and managed in line with the rules and requirements that we operate under. Next slide. Thank you. So the agenda today, we're going to run through an overview of the Go Create grants and the process. So that's eligibility, what the grants can be used for, how you apply, the various different rules that have to be followed, the key dates, and new for this version of the webinar, some case studies on previous grant recipients. Then going to run a brief session, a few slides on why applications are unsuccessful, and then we'll break for a Q&A session. I'll be joined for the Q&A session by Sophie Lee, who's the Programme Executive running the Innovation Support for Business project, and Peter Russell, who's the Business Advisor for the programme. There's a critical email address at the bottom of the agenda slide, innovation@oxfordshirelep.com. This is the email address to contact the team, contact the ISfB programme. If you have a question, if we finish the webinar and you suddenly realise there was a question you wanted to ask or something that occurs to you that wasn't clear, that's the email address to use, please. One of the team will pick that up. It's monitored every day. So we'll push straight on into the next slide with a bit of background on OxLEP. Who are we? We're the Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership. We're one of a network of, I think it's around about 29 local enterprise partnerships across England. We're responsible for supporting, developing the economy, skills, green growth, all the various different elements that go to make a successful local area economy. The specific part of OxLEP that this programme falls under is OxLEP Business. Within the business team, this programme is part of the wider Growth Hub activity. All local enterprise partnerships have a Growth Hub. Some operate that as a phone call, a phone line rather, that you can call. Others have it as basic as a website with resources to access. OxLEP operates what I tend to refer to as a full service Growth Hub. So we provide business support, one-to-one, one-to-many, we provide grants, we provide advice, we provide guidance, we provide brokerage. So if you haven't already made contact with the Growth Hub, please do so. Next slide. The first thing to say, and you'll have noticed, so I just need to plug this laptop in, otherwise it won't survive. There we are. From the logo at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, is that this is European Regional Development Fund money. So the elephant in the room for this is the UK's departure from the European Union, and whether there have been any changes as a result of that. The first bullet point on the slide gives you the simple answer: none. There have been no changes. EU-funded programmes remain part of the European Structural and Investment Fund until they close. So they will continue to be governed by the EU regulations, same as they always have been, and by the UK Managing Authority's guidance, which is based on those regulations. So from our point of view, nothing has changed in the operation and delivery of these programmes. Next slide. Thank you. So who is eligible? The simple answer is small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. So an SME is a business that has less than 250 employees, is not more than 25% owned by a business that itself is not an SME. So what that means is if you're 50% owned by Microsoft, for example, you will not qualify as an SME. If you're 50% owned by another business that is an SME, then you'd look at the number of employees for both businesses, and realistically you would still qualify as an SME. There's a couple of exemptions to this, so it is a little bit complicated. Universities and research institutions and venture capital type organizations do not count. So if you're 50% owned by a venture capital organization that happens to be a non-SME because it's got a huge balance sheet, that actually will not affect your SME status. It can be a little bit complicated to check all that out. So if you're in any doubt, please contact the team, we'll help you through that. Similarly, for an SME, you need a turnover of less than 50 million euros and or a balance sheet of less than 43 million euros, which is based on your most recent set of published accounts. The one other thing I should mention is that within the regulations, the eligibility is defined in terms of undertakings rather than the abbreviation SME. And what that means is that sole traders are eligible. You have to be an undertaking, trading, effectively delivering a business. So if you are trading, be it as a sole trader or a limited company, potentially as a charity, you're eligible to apply for a Go Create grant. Next slide. Thank you. The other thing that we have to look at are whether you're an undertaking in difficulty. Now this is defined in the regulations. So if you are less than 3 years old, it doesn't matter. We don't have to do the test. The regulations assume that you cannot be an undertaking in difficulty. The reason for that is that in the first 3 years, it's expected that you're going to be making losses, that you've got setup costs that you won't have in future years. So what makes an undertaking in difficulty? The short version of this, and the 4 fairly small bullet points on the slide go into detail, but the short version of this is a business that has lost more than half of its subscribed share capital as a result of cumulative losses. So if you've lost money year on year and it's eaten up more than half of the subscribed share capital, you're deemed to be an undertaking in difficulty. The other categories that count are if you are subject to insolvency proceedings or if you're in receipt of rescue or restructuring aid. Now, when the COVID pandemic hit, the regulations were flexed so that you were looking at the age and position of the business as at the end of December 2019, and that flexibility was extended to June 2021. So last month, we were able to look at the position of businesses as of December 2019. We're now just over a week into July. I haven't yet seen whether that flexibility has been extended, but it's certainly something that's on my radar to follow up and to check. Carrying out the test is very simple. It's a calculation based on the balance sheet of your last full year of accounts or your position 31st December, assuming that's extended. And you will already have completed a self-declaration in your sign-up form to show that you're not an undertaking in difficulty. There is a requirement on us to do this check formally if you're applying for more than £50,000 of support, of aid, which is quite unlikely for anyone participating in ISfB. But otherwise, we do have to do random spot checks on applicants, grant recipients, and project participants. Next slide, please. So I've mapped out on the next slide a fairly simple table that shows you different pass-fail criteria. Capital of £10,000, you haven't made any losses, obviously you pass. capital of £10,000, cumulative losses of £4,999, you still pass because you have not yet lost more than half of your share capital. If those losses, however, are £5,001, you would fail the test. It is a very clear line in the sand, which is one of the problems with the test. And similarly, if your share capital is 10,000 and you have cumulative losses of 15,000, you would fail the test. There is a slightly odd position with regard to businesses that don't happen to have any share capital. Basically, you cannot have any accumulated losses. If you have no share capital and £1 of cumulative losses, you fail the test. You're classed as a business in difficulty. And that's why when I describe it, I say that it is a blunt test. It's not something that is nuanced. Critical thing is to speak to your accountant, and the little formula at the bottom of the slide is how I've described the undertaking difficulty test. Capital plus cumulative profit and loss has to be greater than or equal to capital divided by 2. Next slide. So what are the key eligibility issues for Go Create grants? We cannot fund staff costs. So anyone who is on payroll, who goes through PAYE, is not going to be an eligible cost for a Go Create grant. VAT costs, these can only be included and reclaimed as part of the grant if you are not registered for VAT, or for whatever reason you cannot recover VAT from HMRC. It's quite important there. I think the most important part of that sentence is the bit in brackets, the bit that says seek advice. We are not tax advisors and we cannot give VAT advice. In all cases, if you're not sure what your VAT treatment should be for a Go Create grant, you should ask your tax advisor, ask your accountant, whoever does your VAT returns for you. It is not, unfortunately, a simple area. A procurement audit trail and 3 quotes. We require this for any item less than £25,000, so 24,999 and below. We need to see 3 written quotes as part of the audit trail. And that is to reassure an auditor that the public money that is contributing to your grant project has been competitively spent. So you haven't just gone to the person that you always use, or your brother-in-law or your sister-in-law, and given them £20,000, part of which is public funding. So we do need to see 3 written quotes. For anything over 24,999, so £25,000 and above, has to go through an open procurement process. And what that means in this context is that as well as being advertised on your website, it needs to appear on the government's contracts finder website. You as SMEs should be able to register for that, although it is, I understand, a bit of a production for SMEs to register. And therefore we're happy to advertise on Contracts Finder on your behalf. But it means that as well as the adverts, you need a formal specification that describes what you're buying, sets a deadline for responses, a maximum value for the procurement, and sets out the methodology by which you will score and assess the responses. You then need to score the responses, keep a record of that, notify successful and unsuccessful applicants. We have a checklist that we've developed to help you through this, and we're more than happy to support in the process. An issue that often comes up is using or wanting to use suppliers who are already involved in the applicant's business. This isn't a problem. You can do this, provided you've been through the 3 quotes or the procurement process that I've just mentioned. We're not saying that you have to go out and find a brand new supplier to do whatever piece of work you're looking for. But what we are saying is that you need to have gone through a process in order to demonstrate that this is the best response and the best value for money. The other eligibility issue that people sometimes come up against is evidencing defrayal. Usually it's quite simple. You receive an invoice, you pay it from your bank account. The two pieces of evidence are the invoice and then the matching bank account, redacted but still showing the defrayal that matches the invoice. You've paid them. However, people also pay for things on credit cards. This is perfectly acceptable, but it adds an extra step into the process. From an audit point of view, when you pay an invoice using a credit card, you have not paid that invoice. Your credit card provider has paid that invoice for you. They have effectively lent you some money in order to pay that invoice. The cost is only considered to be defrayed by you as a grant recipient at the point at which you repay the credit card. So if I spend £1,000 on a credit card to pay a supplier invoice, I can only include that cost in a claim to OxLEP once I've made a payment to the credit card for at least £1,000. So you have to be able to show that you have paid off from a bank account at least the value of the amount that you're claiming. People also sometimes use overseas bank accounts. If you have a supplier who invoices in euros and you have a euro account with a balance in it, it makes sense to save transaction fees by paying from that account. That is perfectly acceptable, but please let us know in advance if you plan to do this. The reason for that is that if you pay from a UK bank account, then the UK bank account, yes, will charge a fee, but will also apply a very clear exchange rate and fee to the transaction. So what that means is that from an audit trail perspective, you will have an invoice in euros, sorry, hand on the screen. You will then have a bank account statement that has the same euro figure on it and also a sterling figure, and it is the sterling figure that you'll be putting into your claim. So for an auditor, they can follow the euros all the way through to the sterling amount that you're claiming. If you use an overseas bank account, there will be an invoice with a euro figure. There will be a matching euro figure defrayed from the bank account, but there is nothing in the audit trail that then matches that euro figure to the sterling figure that you're putting into your claim. So the critical thing there is to understand and use the right exchange rate and to be able to explain to us and to an auditor which exchange rate you've chosen. Next slide. So there is a difference in this program between revenue and capital costs. There are no capital costs within the Go Create grants. They are only revenue grants. However, any individual item that costs less than £4,999, excluding VAT, is deemed to be a revenue cost. An individual item that costs over £1,000 but less than the £4,999 is deemed to be a mobile asset. It's still a revenue cost, but if you have purchased a mobile asset, a laptop, potentially a fume cupboard or a 3D printer, whatever it may be, that mobile asset will have to be recorded in the ISfB project asset register, which captures details like the serial number, the location, the price, the depreciation period, etc. But it also needs to come with photos, photographs of the asset in situ, so where it actually lives, and a photograph that shows the serial number on it. If you are going to do this, please don't just send us a lovely close-up photo of a printer so that we can't see anything outside of the printer, because the first question the auditor has is, how do I know that printer is in an office and not sitting in somebody's garage? We need to see a bit of context around it so that we can convince an auditor that it is exactly where it is supposed to be, and more importantly, being used for the purposes for which it was purchased. So anything that costs more than £5,000 is capital, and it's not eligible. We did offer a capital element to Go Create grants, but nobody responded to it, nobody took it up. Next slide. So there are a series of things that we can't fund. Salary costs I've talked about, anything that goes through PAYE, anywhere where you incur a national insurance or a pension cost yourself is not eligible. Doesn't mean that if you employ a consultancy firm to do work, you will indirectly be paying national insurance and pension costs for your consultants, but they're not going through your books, they're not your salary costs. We can't fund travel and expenses costs. We can't fund VAT payments that you can recover from HMRC, which I've mentioned earlier. And we can't fund any debt or refinancing costs. So we can't cover any cost that includes an element of interest. Nor can we fund costs that relate to statutory or legislative requirements. So if you're developing your innovation and it is a legal requirement that you have a certain bit of testing done or that you have a certain certification done, the cost of obtaining that certification or testing is not eligible. There might be some preparation costs that are optional that would lead up to it that would be eligible, but the costs relating to meeting the requirements are not eligible. If, however, there's testing or certification that goes beyond the statutory requirements, so we have to have level 3 certification, but our customers will be happier if we had level 4. The level 3 is not eligible, but level 4 would be, because it is not a statutory requirement. Training is something that we can't fund. This doesn't include leadership and management development, so things like mentoring, but we can't fund training courses for staff. That is because training is covered by the European Social Fund, so different parts of the structural funds, and this is the Regional Development Fund. We absolutely can't cover vehicle purchases or any hire purchase arrangements because they have an element of interest in those costs. Next slide. We really absolutely can't cover vehicle purchases. This is deliberately in there twice, and it's because when auditors come to Oxfordshire, it is one of the things that they look for. An Oxfordshire project quite a few years ago now had an underspend as they came up to the end of the year, decided that the most effective way of using that underspend was to go out and buy a car. We still get visits from the same auditor who came and looked at that project, and therefore vehicle purchases is something that they explicitly look for. We can't cover normal routine replacement, so like for like. I have a machine that makes 50 widgets an hour, and it's falling apart, so I want to buy a replacement. It's exactly the same machine, it still makes 50 widgets an hour. That's not eligible. There's no added value from that. There's no additional benefit to you as a business. Similarly, we can't fund preventative or remedial maintenance. My machine needs a service because it's slowing down. That's not something that we could fund. If, however, you wanted to upgrade your machine from 50 an hour to 100 an hour, or a machine that would still do 50 an hour but allow you to make 3 different designs of widget, that is something that would be eligible. So there's got to be some additionality to the change. We can't fund the building or refurbishment of retail facilities, so we can't help you fit out a shop front. Because we operate under the de minimis state aid exemption, there are some specific sectors that we can't fund. So the primary production of agricultural goods and fisheries or aquaculture. So no farms, unfortunately, and no fish farms. We can't support the road freight sector, nor can we support services of general economic interest. When I used to do this, in front of a live audience, I used to quite enjoy asking who knew what that meant, and other than the people who'd been to previous editions of the webinar, of the seminar, pretty much nobody knew. It's the sort of thing that OxLEP does. So it's economic development in the public interest, it's things like schools, it's things like the NHS. So it's general public economic interest activities. We can't fund export related activities. Now that does not mean that if you have a grant from us, you're not allowed to export your innovation. Absolutely you are. What it means is that the money, the grant, cannot be used specifically to set up an export infrastructure to enable you to export. And there's different schemes for that. And we can't fund activities that favour domestic over imported goods. So if your application said that we are only willing to use Oxfordshire or UK-based suppliers, we're not willing to use overseas suppliers even though they could supply us, your application will be rejected. That's not eligible. If you want to use a supplier wherever they come from, you need to justify why you've chosen that supplier on their merits. It can't be a geographical discrimination. Next slide. Thank you. So as you can probably expect, there are a series of deliverables that we report. We report the amount of grant that we've given you, which is easy, we've paid you. We report the amount of match that you've provided against that grant. Again, we have that information from your application and claim forms. We will also need to report on employment increases, so that's new jobs created within your business, new products that you've introduced either to the firm and or to the market, and new businesses that we've supported. Now, a new business is deemed to be one that's less than 12 months old at the point we start supporting you. And again, this is one of those things that we will already know. We will have that detail from your sign-up form. But the employment increase, the new products to firm and market, and incidentally, the new collaborations with research institutions, which is quite an important one for us, and I should have added to the slide. Evidence is needed, so there is, at its most basic, a form to fill out. So for new jobs, that says at the start of the support I had however many jobs, at the end of the support I had additional number of jobs, and those 3 extra jobs, whatever it may be, are as a direct result of the support I've received. And there's a similar form for the other deliverables. There's also backup evidence that supports that. So in terms of new jobs, equalities data, anonymized, of course, on your new hires. And for new products to the firm and market, it will be things like marketing collateral. So your product is new to the market. We would expect to see a screenshot, for example, of a website that says we are now launching our new product, and this is it. It should be things that you would have anyway. Next slide. So the Innovation Support for Business project has 3 elements to it. Development of innovation facilities, which have now been completed, innovation support products, so that is one-to-one and one-to-many business support products, and the Go Create grants, which is the subject of the webinar. Originally, the project had a series of partners, so the University of Oxford, the City Council, Chilwell District Council, and Oxford University Hospitals Trust. Their involvement ended at the end of last year. So at the moment, OxLEP as the lead delivery partner is delivering the whole of the ISfB programme. Next slide. So how much is there? I suspect some people who haven't seen the webinar were wondering if I would ever get to a slide like this. The original budget for the Go Create grant pot was £875,000 of grant available to be paid out. So far, we've committed just under £670,000. which means that we have about 205,000 just over left to commit, which is 23.4% of the grant pot. Anyone who's seen this webinar more than once will probably notice that the uncommitted amount is gradually coming down as we commit funding after each round. We anticipate that the maximum grant we will give to any one organisation is £50,000. If you suspect that you will apply for a grant that is higher than that, please contact the team to discuss it. The minimum grant is £1,000. So if your grant project is £950 of grant, it can't be approved. It has to be £1,000. And the grant rate is at most 25%. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what can we cover? I've said that Go Create grants are revenue costs. You can cover investment in product and service development, research, both technological and applied, development of pilot lines, the validation for early product, and even all the way up to first production. So right from the research stage all the way through to bringing something into the market. So the grants do cover the life cycle of innovation and product development. Next slide. And we take a very wide approach to interpreting innovation. It can be a new product, a different product, it can be a new process or a different process, a new or different service. So we don't have a particular focus on any one of those. We funded grant projects under all of those elements. The critical thing from our point of view is that you demonstrate within your grant application the level of innovation. That's one of the questions that's in there. What is it that makes your product, process or service innovative compared either to what you do already or compared to what else is available on the market? Next slide. So how does it work? So we make your grant offer, and in this example you've said that you will have total spend of £40,000, which would be revenue only. I notice I haven't updated the slide. The maximum grant we would offer would be £10,000, and the grant rate would be 25% of total eligible spend. So you have your grant offer, you go out, you spend £40,000, you make a claim to us, we will repay £10,000, which is 25% of what you spent. Fine. However, we live in the real world. These are innovation projects. They very rarely run as you expect them to run at the beginning. And I think it's fairly safe to say that they never run exactly as you anticipate they will at the beginning. So I've mapped out a couple of scenarios in relation to this grant offer. So in the first scenario, your £40,000 project didn't cost as much to deliver, so you underspent. Your total spend was £30,000. In that instance, the maximum grant we can pay is 25% of your total spend, which is £7,500. Okay, so the grant is capped at the grant rate. We cannot exceed the 25% grant rate that we've offered. In scenario 2, you overspend, so your total spend ends up being £50,000. In this case, the maximum grant we can pay is £10,000 against that grant offer letter, because that is the maximum grant cash value which we have offered. So the grant is capped at either the grant rate or the cash value that we have offered, whichever is smaller. And we will spend a bit of time talking through with successful applicants what that looks like and how that works. Next slide. So how do you apply? Read the guidance on the website. We have guidance, we have FAQs on the website. You can watch this webinar as many times as you like. It will appear on YouTube and there'll be a link to it from the website. You should speak to the team and the ISfB Business Advisor. Complete the application form using the checklist that we've provided. It is a very helpful tool for making sure that you've completed the application fully and not missed anything. I know it is, I wrote it. And then wait and see. We do have a clear timetable for reviewing and assessing applications, and we will contact you on or before the date that we say we will. Next slide, which is set out on the next slide. So we're having monthly cutoff dates for Go Create grants at the moment. The next one falls in July in 8 days' time, so a week tomorrow. It's midday on the 16th, and we will notify applicants of the outcome of that application round on or before the 6th of August. So please don't chase us on the 5th of August if you haven't heard from us. But if you haven't heard from us by the 7th, then you should chase us. If we think timescales will slip, so if we think there's going to be a delay, we will notify you of that delay and let you know what the revised timetable would be for notifying you of the outcome. The August cutoff date is the 20th. It's always the third Friday of the month at midday, and the notification date for that is the 10th of September. And we do monthly reviews, as is fairly clear. Just a little note at the bottom, in early stages of the Go Create grants, we were able to offer a soft check proofreading service for applicants. At the moment, we don't have the capacity to do that. If that changes, we will let you know. Next slide. So what are the rules? I've talked about defrayed expenditure. We can only reimburse money that has been paid out of a bank account, and it has to be incurred after the date of the grant offer letter. Okay, so if you have already spent £10,000 towards your project before you apply to us, that £10,000 will not be eligible. We will not be able to approve the project because an auditor would say they had already started the project, therefore they very clearly did not need the grant to deliver the project because they were willing to start it. Okay. The procurement rules I've touched on, 3 quotes are required. There may be instances where there is only one supplier. Facebook ads is the one that I now tend to use as an example for this. If you're going to advertise on Facebook, the only person who can give you a quote for that, or the only organisation who can give you a quote for that, is Facebook. That is one of the few situations in which we are able to accept a single quote. Evidence is critical for all of this, so keep a full audit trail of everything you've done. Keep your quotes, keep your invoices, keep your defrayal, keep records of activity. So I do sometimes ask whether we're flexible or rigid. We're as flexible as we can be within a fairly rigid framework. Next slide. So now I'm going to hand over to Sophie Lee, who's the Programme Executive for ISfB, and she's going to talk us through a couple of case studies of successful Go Create grant recipients.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everybody. As James noted, I'm the Programme Executive for ISfB, so oversee the delivery for the project. Just wanted to bring to life really a few examples of some clients we've supported who've applied through successfully received funding through the Go Create funding rounds. So as you can see there, we've got a few different sectors. There are quite a range of sectors that we've supported. EcoSync, the grant supported development of a low-cost hardware logger. Educate, they produced an education and technology project for online homework, which was really successful, particularly when COVID-19 hit, and the schools were all moving to online work. Electricity, the grant supported development of a prototype, miniaturized PV energy harvester, and an autonomous sensor system. And then Oxwash, who produced a new bespoke software package, enabling growth and scaling up of their existing MVP model. So you can see quite a few different ranges of projects there that the grants have supported. Next slide, please. Thank you. And here's just a bit more information on one of the recent projects, Creation Theatre. So the grant, Creation applied for a grant during COVID-19. They had to pivot their business as theatre productions weren't going ahead face-to-face. So they had to rethink their business model, and they could no longer perform in front of a live audience. So the Go Create grant meant that they could pivot to online digital delivery of some of their theatre productions. So they need some financial support for that, and due to the innovative nature of the shows, they found themselves eligible for the Go Create grant, and they were successful in receiving that funding. The grant funding was used to put on a production of a Christmas show, and they were able to deliver that over a couple of weeks running up to Christmas, and it allowed them to use vision mixing technology for the first time. And they've put in there, you know, it's taken this from a very local and geographically limited business with a lot of physical limitations to having a global reach audience. So they had people attending the shows from all over the world, which was an amazing success. So that you can read the full case study there. There's the link there to the Creation Theatre one, but we have a full range of case studies on the OxLEP Business website. So do go and have a look. There's a little yellow mark at the top right of the ones that have been supported through ISfB. Not all of them have received Go Create grants through the case studies, but quite a few of them. So have a look through there and have a read through of some of the different types of projects we've supported. I'll be back shortly for the Q&A session. Thank you. I'll hand back over to James.
Thank you, Sophie. Next slide, please. So now we're moving on to the second part of my presentation, where I talk about why applications are unsuccessful. There is a reason that I don't deliver a session called How to Write a Successful Application, and that is partly because it's far more useful learning from things that have gone wrong as examples, but also because this is a competitive process. So you could write an application, there's nothing wrong with your application. You can do everything that I might advise you to do in terms of writing a successful application, but you still don't receive funding. So I provide a session on lessons learned from 20 odd years of writing, reading, reviewing and scoring grant applications. So the first thing is length. So think Goldilocks. Your application should neither be too long nor too short. So what I mean by that is that we give you a word limit within the application form. It is not a target. If you can say everything that you need to tell us in order for us to understand and assess your application in 2/3 of the space, do that. You don't get points for filling the space. At the same time, if you've only written one paragraph, realistically your application is too short. It is very unlikely that anyone will be able to provide enough information for assessors to understand and assess their applications if they've only written a paragraph for each question. Don't be obtuse. What do I mean by that? Don't use long, complicated words like obtuse. Try to keep your applications clear and simple. You will be the expert in your business and your business area. It is very unlikely that the assessors will have the same level of expertise. It's critical, therefore, that you are clear and you don't use highly technical or sector-specific jargon in explaining your application. I've seen applications which have included half a page effectively of chemical formulas. That is almost certainly interesting to a chemist working in that particular field, but it really doesn't add much to the majority of assessors who are going to be looking at an application form. Think about what we need to know and think about how you convey that to us clearly and simply. Also think about style. I say spell checker is there for a reason within Word. Please use it. Nobody will ever be turned down on the basis of spelling mistakes, typos, or poor grammar. That's not what we score for. However, assessors are only human. When you see an application that is filled with spelling mistakes, that is difficult to read, and in some cases, if it's written badly enough, it can be impossible to understand, but assuming we can understand it, the spelling mistakes, the grammar mistakes will raise queries in an assessor's mind about attention to detail. How much attention to detail, how much effort was really put into this application form? And the result of that is that you tend to be scored, judged more harshly than an application that has run the spell check through the application form. Very much linked to that are issues about quality. It is very obvious when applications have been rushed, so please take your time. If you are starting to write an application now for submission in the July deadline, you've got about a week from today, that's just about enough time. It's cutting it a bit tight, but it's just about enough time. If you're starting it a week today, so 24 hours before the deadline, you have not left yourself enough time to do the application. You're not going to be able to do yourself justice, and it will be very clear to an assessor that an application has been rushed. I would say use our checking service. I've mentioned earlier that we're not able to offer that at the moment, but if it changes, we'll let you know. But do speak to the team, speak to Peter, the business advisor, if you need any advice on your application or you have any questions that are not covered elsewhere. And in terms of quality, please be consistent. When we see an application form that asks for £24,000 of grant on page 1, if the application form then asks for £23,000 somewhere else, 22.5 somewhere else, and 25,000 in the third place, it is very, very difficult for us to assess it and to score it highly because we don't actually know what you're looking for. We don't know whether it's the 24, the 25, the 22.5, or the 23. So please make sure you're consistent throughout the application form. Please fill everything in. Although it may be hard to believe, compliance people do not believe in creating boxes on forms just because we can. They are all there for a purpose. If you've left a box blank, can you put not applicable in it and it still makes sense? So we see application forms where the question about other sources of funding, describe other sources of funding that you've looked for. It's left blank because you haven't looked at any other sources of funding. That makes sense. However, an application form that leaves the grant requested box blank or the grant rate box blank doesn't work. You can't put not applicable in your grant requested or grant rate box because the form does not make sense. So check that the form would make sense with not applicable in there. Next slide. In terms of the content, excuse me, prior knowledge is always a problem. As I've said, you're very familiar with your business area and your technology and your innovation, the assessors will not be. If they have enough knowledge about your business and your specific innovation, then realistically they'll have a conflict of interest and they wouldn't be able to assess your application. Therefore, you're addressing your application to people who do not have a depth of prior knowledge in your sector. Applications that come in and assume that assessors already know the background to a specific technical sector or a specific market or a specific business sector tend to score less highly because they haven't set the business in context. You've assumed that we know things. So if you find yourself writing an application and thinking, excuse me, that something goes without saying, stop and pause. It never does. It is always worth setting that out. When you're writing the applications, we often see people who are so desperate to jump in and tell us about the grant project that they're applying for, that effectively they start in the middle of an application. They don't start at the beginning and set the context of the business. This is where we are, this is where we've come from, this is what we do. They then don't go on to the middle bit, which is this is the grant project, this is what we want to do, and it's how it fits in with the business. And then finishing at the end, which is, and this is the impact it will have on our business. So what you're doing is, to use a phrase that I really don't like, but haven't been able to improve on yet, you're telling us a story. You're telling us what we need to know to assess your application in the context of your business and in the context of your sector. So what does the business do? What is the problem? What is the project going to do, which links back to the business and the problem? And what is the impact that that's going to have? What will be the results? And with all of that, you need to think about the relevance of the content. Is it something that we need to know in order to assess your application? So going back to an example I used earlier, we probably didn't need half a page of chemical formulas in order to assess that specific application. And you could have used that half page to provide us with more high level, if you like, content and background on the business. So think about what it is you're telling us. Having said all of that, there are word limits on these, and there will be instances where there are things that you think we need to know that you just can't fit in for whatever reason. You can use attachments and provide additional documents. There are some things that we specifically request, so business plan, copies of accounts, that sort of thing, and quotes. But you may provide additional attachments, additional documents. If you're going to do that, I always say that it should be done sparingly. I've seen applications come in with 200 or 300 page attachments, and there is an assumption, I think, on the part of the applicant that somebody is actually going to look through 200 or 300 page documents as part of the assessment process. Assessors do not have time for that. The time allowed for assessments is enough to assess the documents that we have asked for, and enough time, to think about the applications and write up your assessment notes. It does not allow you to read documents that are 2 or 3 times as long as the application in addition to the application. If you must use attachments, and especially if they are long attachments, the critical thing is to tell us where to look. So for more information on our previous experience in this sector, see pages 23 to 4 of attachment A. In that way, an assessor can go and have a look at those 2 pages, and it's a realistic ask for an assessor. Clearly, please don't say, please see pages 25 to 75 of attachment A, because there won't be enough time. If, however, your attachment is a flyer, for example, it could be a 2-page flyer for your innovation, it's highly likely that an assessor will have enough time to open that and look at the 2 pages as part of the assessment process. Bear in mind that throwing in the kitchen sink alongside your application doesn't guarantee that it will be looked at. So use them sparingly and direct us to them. Next slide. In terms of the process, RTQ, read the question. I always tell a story about a history teacher I had once who told us that they wrote the best essay they'd ever written in their life in their final exams at university on 18th century France. And they got 5 minutes from the end of the exam period. And as you do, she was flicking back through the exam paper and realized that it should have been written on 17th century France. Read the question and understand the question. We provide detailed bullet points within the application form and in the guidance to help understand this. Similarly, once you've read the question, ATQ is answer the question, and this goes back to think about the relevance of the content. Assessors are always scoring against the questions that have been asked. If you don't answer those questions, or you answer a slightly different question, it is very difficult for assessors to give high marks. Quite frequently, applications will come in to all programs all throughout the country that provide very good answers to a question that you haven't really asked. Similarly, in terms of process, 3 quotes means 3 quotes. If it really is impossible, then you will have confirmation from companies that they can't quote. The ideal response from me as a compliance person is a quote from one company, and then your other 2 suppliers have written back saying this isn't something that we can do. The only people we can think of who could possibly do this are company X, and company X is the one that you got the quote from. That remains the ideal. I've never seen it, I must admit, but that would be ideal. There are, however, some instances, as I mentioned earlier, Facebook advertising, for example, where you can't get quotes from anyone else because there is a single supplier. If you can't get 3 quotes, talk to us, check with us, and explain in the application form why it's not possible. Next slide. Thank you. So one last thing that I was going to say on the applications being unsuccessful is to try and find somebody to proofread for you. I've talked about telling assessors what we need to know, not assuming prior knowledge. Try to find somebody to proofread an application who is either outside of the business or who has not been involved in writing the application. That's very useful, and it does show when an application hasn't been proofread. So when you have a grant, what do you need to do? The first thing, unsurprisingly, is wait until it's been awarded before you start spending the money. We can only provide support. Sorry, if you can hear the toddler yelling in the background, apologies. It's nap time, and I think he objects. Wait until the grant has been awarded before spending the money. The date from which you can incur spend will be set out in the grant offer letter. Please then actually spend it. If there are delays, that's fine. Things happen, these are innovation projects, but please let us know. And then claim it. I'm always amazed that I do need to put this bullet point in, but there are instances in which businesses have spent the money, they've completed their grant project, they just don't get round to putting the claim in for reimbursement. I always find that surprising, but it does happen. And as I've said, if there are any delays or anything changes, please tell us, please contact us. This is not a situation in which it is better to ask for forgiveness than permission. It is always better to come to us before you do anything different, or as soon as you know there's going to be a delay, so that we can work with you and make sure that whatever changes you make, whatever it is you propose to do about the delay, remain eligible so that your project is still something that we can fund. And please make sure you provide the necessary evidence with the claim so that we can validate the audit trail and make the claim payment as quickly as possible. If the evidence is missing, all that will happen is that we will come back to you and request it, and we will not be able to pay the claim until we've got a complete audit trail in place. Next slide. So for more information, you can watch this again. The slides and the guidance notes are published on the OxLEP website. There are FAQs, which we will update when we receive any new or additional question and answers. And as I said right at the beginning on the agenda slide, email any additional questions to innovation@oxfordshirelep.com. And good luck. Next slide. So I think we're now opening up to questions. So I will invite both Sophie and Peter Russell to join me. There we are. There we go.
Thanks, James, and welcome, Peter. Do you want to introduce yourself, Peter?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name's Peter Russell, and I'm the Innovation Advisor for the ISfB program. So I work directly with clients, including on their potential applications and other innovation support matters I can give.
Thank you, Peter. We haven't actually had any questions through, but maybe a few will filter through in the next few minutes. Please do send through questions on the chat if you have any questions directly from the presentation that James has delivered, or questions you may want to ask Peter. We did have one question through during the presentation. It was just about the average grant amount awarded. So I've just gone back on that one. We have varied values of grants that we've awarded, but the average has been about 17,500. So I've gone back on that one, but you know, it might be interesting information for others. Peter, do you want anything to add at this point while we see if there's any other questions that are coming through?
No, well, I think the only thing I would say, at the risk that it's already been said, because I've only just joined, is that what we'd rather you did, if you have some ideas for a potential project or a potential application, and you're not quite sure about whether it fits, rather than go to the bother of completely filling in an application form, or a draft one at least, then get in contact with us, send us an email outlining what you're thinking of doing, timescales, potential suppliers, and so on. And then we'll give you some feedback on that, rather than you progress too far and then find out that it wasn't really applicable. So obviously that extends the timescale somewhat. I know James did say, and I agreed with him, that if you start now, you probably could get an application in for next Friday. However, I think it's doubtful you do all the other things that you need to do to have a successful application, including getting all the quotations and things that you need. So I would start the process of engaging with us as soon as you've got an idea, basically. And we're here to help you shape that idea to fit with the scheme.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, and just to add, I think James mentioned earlier, but you can send through the summary of your projects or any queries you have to the innovation inbox email address. We'll be sharing the slides after this webinar closes. Got a question here. Can the grant be used for development of an online platform or an app to help deliver wellbeing support?
Yeah, the answer is yes. You would have to point out to us or point out to the panel and argue why that app and indeed the platform is innovative, because there is quite a lot of those things around at the moment, and some of them are gaining a lot of market share very quickly. So as well as showing us how yours is different in some way, new to you, but hopefully new to the market as well, you'd have to show us why you think you've got a reasonable chance of successfully commercializing it, taking it to the market. But yes, absolutely, we've funded quite a lot of app development, and quite often at the early stage where you're looking to do a minimum viable product or something to enable you to test the market more fully. So if you're at a relatively early stage and you want to get something out there so that you can indeed get some good and realistic customer feedback, then we can support that part of the process, absolutely.
Thank you, Peter. There was just another quick question on whether we're sharing the presentation. Yeah, we'll distribute the slides and the links to the webinar and to our grant pages within the next couple of days after the webinar closes. So we'll definitely share all that information with you. We haven't had any further questions at this point. So we'll maybe just wait a couple of minutes, see if any more questions come through. But otherwise, as Peter said, please get in touch with the team on the email address there on the slide with any questions you have and a summary of your planned project. And then we can, the team will review that and come back to you to see if that fits in within the scope of ISfB. Got another question here. Is if you have a prototype and want grants to take further, is that also possible?
Yeah, yes. We are able to support most parts of the innovation process, to be honest. So whether you're at a conceptual stage, so very early, or whether you're quite close to the market and you need some help with finally launching, then we can consider, the panel will consider either or both of those parts of the process. So if you've got a prototype, that's great, and you need to move that prototype on by some further development or some marketing or some related costs, not product related costs, for example, then we can look at those applications as well. We don't define which part of the innovation journey, if you like, that we support, and we also don't define the costs. It's for you to make an argument that in order to successfully launch something, the help that you need is more market research or marketing or product development or design work, app, software, whatever it is. It's up for you to make that argument.
Thank you, Peter. No further questions at this point. Anything else to add, James or Peter, unless we get any last minute questions through?
The only thing I'd add is that it's probably been covered by James and maybe yourself, Sophie, but so if you want to find out a little bit more about the kind of projects that we have supported, I think Sophie's probably mentioned that we've got a number of case examples and things, so it gives you a flavour of the breadth and the variety of projects that have gone through the programme. I think that would be a worthwhile thing to do if you're not sure, on these questions about whether something fits or not. And then the final one for me was a bit more bureaucratic, that it's not often the writing of the application that holds people up. It's the assembling of the appropriate evidence. So have a close look at what evidence we need in terms of, for example, business plans and procurement information, quotations or open tender process. That's the bit which people fall over and then realise that they can't meet the deadline. So if you're not sure about those things, contact us as well.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, gave a small update earlier on the case studies, so we'll obviously share that in the slides, and the web address is there for OxLEP Business website. If you just head there and then click on case studies, it's got the full range of case studies through OxLEP, so not just through ISfB, but as I said, there's a little yellow rectangle at the top right, so you can kind of pick out the ones that are related to ISfB and innovation projects. So as Peter said, it's worthwhile having a read through of some of those. So I think we'll close the Q&A session at this point then. No further questions have come through, but as we said, please get in contact with the team if you have anything further that you want to ask after the webinar closes. Thank you very much to James for the presentation this morning, and for Peter for joining the panel, and I wish you very good luck with your projects, and thank you very much for joining the webinar this morning.
Absolutely.
Yeah, good luck, everybody.